Hello and welcome, my friends. I am your humble host, Scully, and this is Macabre Minutes, where the ordinary unravels and the shadows tell their secrets. If this is your first time visiting my channel and you happen to enjoy psychological thrillers and frightening tales of the paranormal, well, you've come to the right place. Should you enjoy tonight's tale, I hope you subscribe, stab that like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And please, leave a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. Now, if you have been here before, welcome back. I am so happy we can continue this horrifying journey together. Now, a word of caution. Tonight's tale includes some suggestive themes in adult situations. So if you have children, it's time to put them to bed before you listen to this tale. This one's not for them. Tonight, we'll discover how two hikers looking for a place to camp learn why there's some places not marked on a map, and for good reason. So, pour yourself a drink, find your favorite comfy spot, and turn out the lights. Join me now as we read my new tale, Chester Creek Village. Emily's boots sank half an inch into the wet, greedy earth with every step. The Appalachian Mountains had always cradled her favorite hiking trails, but this time they were off-trail, off-map, and if she was being completely honest, dangerously off-course. Nate, of course, was still grinning like they'd just unearthed buried treasure. "Are you sure this is the right direction?" Emily asked, brushing a damp strand of coppery hair from her cheek. Her voice was steady, but her emerald green eyes darted through the trees, tracking the dense underbrush like it might come alive at any moment. The air hung thick with Appalachian mist, cool and clinging, but Emily couldn't tell if the moisture on her skin came from the mountain fog or the slow creep of her own unease. "Not exactly," Nate said with a crooked grin, eyes gleaming beneath the brim of his cap. "But come on, Em, this is what we wanted, right? No people, no crowds, no tents 10 feet away. Just us, the fire, and a sky full of stars." Nate walked a few feet ahead, effortlessly confident as he cut through the undergrowth. His worn canvas pack hung from one shoulder, and the sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled to the elbows, exposing forearms freckled and scratched from days of hiking. His blonde hair, sun-bleached and unruly, was damp with sweat, and his breath came fast from the climb. He looked like someone carved from the woods themselves, as if he belonged here. Emily, however, wasn't so sure she did. She adjusted her pack and stepped carefully, placing her tan hiking boots with precision between moss-slick roots. Her black leggings were streaked with mud, and her maroon hoodie clung to her slender, fit frame in the wet, cold mountain air. She didn't complain, though, not out loud anyway. "We should have hit the ridge by now," she said. "I think we took a wrong fork back there a ways," Nate replied, then stopped suddenly, raising his hand. "Wait! Look! Down there!" They stood at the edge of a steep, rocky slope. Below them, half veiled by drifting mist, lay the scattered remains of a forgotten settlement, abandoned, sunken, and deathly still. A dozen or so weathered structures leaned into the earth along a cracked stone path, flanked by the dry bed of a long-dead creek. At the center stood a gnarled oak tree, hunched and sprawling, its twisting limbs draped protectively over a stone well strangled in ivy. The well stones were blackened in places, charred, as if fire had touched them once. "What the hell is this place?" Emily whispered. The buildings looked like they'd been built a century ago and left to rot. Roofs sagged like broken spines. Wooden beams bowed inward, siding eaten away by mold and time. Some structures were missing entire walls. Others had doors that dangled half open on rusted hinges. One ruin near the edge had collapsed entirely, its chimney jutting out of the rubble like a gravestone. "This is creepy as hell, but kinda cool, right?" Nate said. "It's like a ghost town, but just for us." Emily stepped forward cautiously. "Shouldn't there be, I don't know, a sign or something?" she asked. Some clue why it's here? Well, there's no trail markers, no roads, not even on the map, Nate said, his eyes gleaming. We were meant to find this place, Em. Emily wasn't so sure. She turned, glancing back toward the woods they'd come through. Somehow the trees looked further away than they should have been. The air had shifted, cooler now, heavier. And then she smelled it, faint but distinct. Do you smell smoke? Emily asked. Nate sniffed and frowned. Well, maybe. Could be old wood or something rotting. Or burning. Nate shrugged. Look, it doesn't matter. Let's check it out. We could camp inside one of the cabins. Stay dry if it rains. Emily hesitated. I don't think we should stay here, she said softly. Her voice was barely louder than the wind. It doesn't feel right. Nate turned to her, the humor dimming just slightly in his expression. Em, it's just a bunch of old buildings. If it makes you feel better, we'll stay one night. First sign of anything weird and we're out, I promise. She looked back down at the settlement, thick fog curling like smoke around the broken rooftops. She swallowed hard. Okay, but just one night. As they made their way down the slope, neither of them noticed the worn, weathered sign. Half buried beneath a fallen branch at the edge of the ruins, the lettering had faded almost to nothing, just flecks of paint clinging to rotted wood. But if you tilted your head just right, in the right kind of light, you might still be able to make out the name that had once been carved there. Chester Creek. The descent into the village was quieter than Emily liked. It wasn't silent, but, there was sound. But it was the wrong kind of sounds. The distant crack of settling wood. The creak of a swinging shutter, rhythmic like a rocking chair. A faint rustling, as though the trees were whispering to one another about the newcomers. They passed the first house on the edge of the village. Its door lay flat on the ground, and the windows were cracked like spiderwebs, framing the hollow dark within. A child's boot sat on the stoop, showing its age by the weathered, rotted appearance. Emily shivered, partly from the cold, partially from the eerie, abandoned place in which they now found themselves. Let's keep looking, Nate muttered, his voice kind of low. That one feels dead. They walked slowly along the stone path. Time had warped it. Stones split by roots, moss growing thick in the cracks like veins spreading through skin. The buildings, once simple cabins or cottages, were now nothing more than crumbled artifacts. Roofs had collapsed inward. Doors were missing or nailed shut. Windows were boarded up from the inside as if the residents were trying to keep something out. Emily stopped at one and peered in. The glass was smudged, but she could make out a table still set for dinner, plates and all, layered with a thick coating of dust. 2 chairs lay on their sides as though someone had left in a hurry. Why would they just leave everything? She asked. Nate didn't answer right away. He was scanning the village with narrowed eyes, his unusual confidence clearly shaken. I don't know. Famine, disease, mine collapse, maybe? Could have been abandoned 100 years ago or more. From the looks of this place, it's been a while. Right then is when they saw the house, coming into view as they rounded a dilapidated cottage. It stood at the far end of the village, set slightly apart from the others, a 2-story structure with faded blue paint peeling in long curling strips. The roof was mostly intact, except for one corner where shingles had fallen away, revealing rotted beams underneath. A rocking chair sat askew on the front porch. The windows were dirty but unbroken. The door, solid oak, with a round iron handle, stood closed. Nate turned to Emily. That's the one, right there. She hesitated, but then nodded her head in agreement. Inside, the air was cool and dry, which was completely unexpected for such an old and ruined place. The floor groaned audibly underneath their weight, but held firm nonetheless. Dust swirled in the filtered light as they stepped into what must have been the living room. A faded floral rug covered warped wooden planks. Books lay scattered near a toppled shelf. and across from a low, sagging couch stood a stone fireplace. "I'll check the upstairs," Nate said. "See if there's a bed or mattress we can use. While I'm at it, why don't you see if there's any wood around here to make a fire?" "Okay, at least if we brought blankets if we can't find anything else," Emily said as she drifted toward the hearth. A stack of cut logs sat in the woven basket nearby, dry and ready, which was odd. Wood that old should have rotted away years ago, but these were perfect. She crouched down in front of the fireplace and built a small pyramid of logs and tinder. In the drawer of a nearby table, she found a box of matches, still dry. She struck one, held it to the tinder, and watched as the logs slowly began to catch. The flames lit the room in soft orange light. Shadows danced up the walls. For the first time all day, she felt she could finally breathe. Nate returned from upstairs. His voice was lighter than before. "Well, there's no bodies," he chuckled. "Just a dusty old bed frame. I think we'll be better off sleeping down here." So they laid out their sleeping bags on top of the rug, then sat down and ate granola bars from their packs while warming their hands by the fire. Outside, the mist had thickened, brushing visibly against the windows like it had been trying to find a way in. As the night wore on, the temperature kept dropping. They drew close together under the blanket, sharing their body heat. Nate pulled Emily into him, curling an arm around her waist. I'm glad we came out here," he said. She looked up at him, his eyes golden in the firelight. "Even though I'm scared out of my mind?" He smiled, his fingers tracing lightly along her jaw. "Especially because of that." Emily leaned in, her breath catching as his hand slipped beneath her hair, resting warm against the back of her neck. The fire bathed their skin in flickering amber light, outlining the curve of her neck and the slope of their back. She shifted, swinging one leg over his lap as the blanket fell away. Nate ran his fingers along her spine, slow and deliberate, feeling the rise and fall of her breath, the quickening beat of her heart. There was nothing but the heat between them, the fire, their bodies, their shared breath. Outside, the mist pressed harder against the glass. And then, tap. Emily froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Nate didn't answer at first. He tightened his arms around her, turning slightly toward the nearest window. Tap, tap, tap. 3 sharp knocks. On glass. He exhaled slowly. "Could be the house settling," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily sat up, scanning the shadows along the walls. "That didn't sound like the house settling, Nate." "Well, maybe something fell on the roof," he offered. And then, thump. Directly above them, heavy, thick. Emily backed against the wall, breath shaky. "Someone's up there." Nate grabbed an iron poker from the fireplace, his knuckles white around the handle. And then, the sound of a door opening slowly from upstairs. Emily's eyes locked on the ceiling. "Nate, don't go up there." "I'm just going to take a look," he said, though his voice was thinner than before. He took a single step toward the stairs, then stopped. There, on the 3rd stair from the bottom, was a footprint. Not a shoe print, a footprint. Bare, human, wet. Emily choked out a whisper. "That wasn't there before." Nate stepped back. The room was filled with a deafening silence. Dust hung thick in the air, so thick that even the edges of his own footprints had smudged and vanished as he had moved through the space. That meant the print on the stair was new and clear. The fire dimmed for a moment, just long enough to make the room feel a little colder. And then, they both turned. Just in front of the fireplace where their sleeping bags had been laid out were now 2 footprints. Bare, wet. Nate's voice was barely audible. "I didn't see that there before." Emily said nothing. Her mouth had gone dry. Knock, knock. Knock! This time from upstairs, from inside the bedroom. 3 steady knocks, each louder than the last. Emily gripped Nate's arm, her nails digging into his skin. And from above, a woman's laughter. High, clear, and unmistakable, and far too close. Then, silence. Instantly. No more knocks, no more laughter. Even the air in the house seemed to relax and the pressure easing. "I don't know what that was," Nate finally said. "But it's over. Probably just the wind messing with this old place, Just maybe water dripping from the roof." "Yeah, sure," Emily whispered. "Just the wind and some leaks." She didn't believe him, but she trusted him to keep her safe. They fixed their bedding in silence, getting back under the blanket and curling up together again. Nate curled an arm around her waist, and they waited for morning, for warmth, for whatever came next. Emily hadn't meant to fall asleep, but sometime after the fire died down and Nate's breathing evened out beside her, her eyes finally closed. When she woke, the world around them had changed. The air in the house was colder now, so cold her breath fogged in the dark. Dampness clung to everything. Her clothes, the sleeping bag, even her skin and hair. The kind of cold and wet that sinks into your bones. She sat up slowly, her joints aching, and looked around the room. The fire she had lit earlier that night had gone out. The only light came from the gray seeping of dawn struggling its way through the cracks in boarded-up windows. Nate mumbled something in his sleep. She watched him for a moment, brow furrowed in a light frown, fingers twitching like he was caught in a dream he couldn't quite escape. A fine sheen of moisture was on his forehead, and his skin looked unusually pale. Emily's throat ached. It was uncomfortably dry and tight. She reached for her water bottle and shook it. Empty. She cursed under her breath and stood, her knees protesting. The cold had stiffened her body, and her head felt foggy, like she hadn't really woken up at all. She glanced back at Nate, still asleep. She didn't want to leave him, not in this place, but she couldn't handle the pain and the dryness in her throat. It was a need she could not ignore. And then, the well. The thought came sudden and uninvited. She hadn't been thinking about it at all, hadn't even remembered it was there. But now she could see it clearly in her mind. Its weathered stones, the rope like a withered tendon, water waiting in the dark, cold and untouched for decades, maybe more. Emily mindlessly pulled on her boots and her hoodie. She didn't even remember making the decision to go outside, but her body just instinctively moved, quietly, purposefully. The front door stuck slightly, as if the damp had swollen the wood in the night. She pressed her shoulder into it, and after a few tries, it finally gave way with a deep groan. The village now lay before her in the dull light of the early morning sunrise. Everything was still and silent, but she couldn't help but feel like she was surrounded, like she was being watched. Mist hung low over the ground, like breath from sleeping mouths, and everything was wet. Not from rain, there hadn't been any, but from some creeping saturation that clung to the earth, like the ground itself had been weeping. The path to the well was overgrown and soft underfoot. Moss squished beneath her boots, and the smell of wet wood and old stone grew stronger the closer she got. The buildings loomed on either side of her. Their crooked frames leaned inward like gossiping old men sharing a secret they'd never dare to speak aloud. The well stood in the center of it all, half swallowed by vines. The wooden cover had long since rotted away, leaving the mouth wide open, ringed with slick stone. The rope still hung, frayed and damp, leading down into the darkness. She reached out and gripped the edge of the well with both hands, leaning over slowly. No sound, no echo, just darkness, and then a faint smell. Iron, earth, something sour beneath it. She lowered the bucket with careful turns of the rusted crank. The rope groaned, dry and brittle, and for a moment she imagined it snapping, like the bucket disappearing into the endless black without a sound. But it didn't. The rope still held strong after all of its years here. The bucket finally reached the water. She felt the slight resistance and heard the soft glug as it submerged. She turned the crank the other way to bring it back up. Slowly, heavily, the bucket rose. A thick line of algae clung to the rope, slick and greenish black. As the bucket reached the surface, she noticed a few strands of something stringy floating on top. It definitely didn't smell fresh. Despite the disgusting and unappealing condition of the water, she would never normally drink it, but her hand reached for it still. She hesitated, trying to stop herself. Her fingers trembled just above the edge. "Why am I doing this?" she asked aloud, her voice hoarse. Feeling as if she had no control over her own body, she dipped her water bottle into the bucket. She meant to only take one sip, just enough to clear the dry and painful rasp from her throat, but instead found herself uncontrollably drinking the water, chugging it down as fast as she could. The instant cold shocked her teeth as she swallowed. It burned down her throat, sharp and immediate, like icy liquid metal. She dropped the bucket. The rope spun wildly, plunging back into the well with a hard slap. Emily's heart pounded. Her mouth tasted of rust and stone and something else she couldn't even place. She stood there for a moment, staring down into the well. But by the time she returned to the house, the mist had thickened. She stepped through the door and locked it behind her with more urgency than she'd meant to. Nate stirred at the sound. Are you okay?" he mumbled. His voice was thick with sleep. She nodded quickly. "Yeah, I just needed some air." "Well, you're all wet," he said, frowning. "And you smell like—" He stopped himself, choosing not to finish that sentence. Emily walked toward her pack, eyes fixed on it like it was the only anchor in the room. She knelt beside it and unzipped it with fingers that felt too cold, too stiff. When she looked down, she noticed her hands were pale, paler than they should be. The veins at her wrist rose in sharp relief, like ink pressed beneath paper. She rubbed her hands together, trying to warm them, telling herself it was just from the cold. But something in her gut, deep and twisting, knew otherwise. Though the fire had burned out, Nate managed to coax it back to life with what remained of the logs. The crackle was soft and steady, pushing back in the morning chill that clung to every board of the house like a second skin. He crouched beside the hearth, holding his dented camping pot steadily over the flame. He used his last bottle of water for this morning coffee. No way in hell he was going to use the well water. After all, you should never trust still water. Emily moved behind him, her presence quiet but undeniable. Nate didn't hear her footsteps. He just felt the change in the room, as though the air had thickened around her. "You were up early this morning," he said without turning. "I didn't sleep much," she said, her voice soft, lifting, sweeter than normal. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that she was leaning in the doorway of the adjacent room, wrapped in nothing but the blanket they had shared through the night. Her hair was messy, falling in waves around her face, and there was a heat in her eyes that wasn't there last night. He smiled back, surprised. "Feeling better that fast?" he asked. She walked slowly toward him, dropping the blanket to the floor as she moved closer, stopping just behind him. "I am now, Nate," she whispered gently. She pressed her bare chest against his back and wrapped her arms around his waist, sliding her palms beneath his shirt. Her hands were cold as ice, but the way she moved, slow, searching, sent a jolt up his spine. "I missed you," she whispered into his ear. "We've been right next to each other this whole time," he chuckled. Her lips brushed the back of his neck. "Not like this," she whispered. She pushed the pot off to the side, not caring about the water, and guided him gently to the floor. She knelt down, legs resting on either side of him. He didn't resist her advances. The firelight flickered across the room, dancing in her eyes as she sat atop him, straddling his waist. He reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, but she caught his hand and kissed his fingertips instead. "My God, you are so beautiful," he said softly. Her hips moved against his, slowly and deliberately. He felt the intensity rising, the tension they both needed to burn off after days of unease. She leaned down, hands planted on either side of his head, her face just above his. But then, something changed. Emily's face contorted. Her expression changed. She didn't look like herself. She didn't look like Emily. The shape of her face hadn't changed, not exactly, but something wasn't right. Her eyes were still green, if but a shade too bright. Her smile was too wide. Her jawline had subtly altered, sharper, unfamiliar. It was like looking at her through water, like something else had slipped beneath the surface and taken hold. His breath hitched. "Em?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tightly gripped his wrists and pressed them firmly into the wooden floor beside his head. Chest to chest, her body was still flush against his, but now there was no warmth in her touch, only pressure. He tried to sit up, but she leaned closer. Her mouth hovered just above his. "I can feel your heart racing," she whispered, the voice almost hers, but with a second voice echoing beneath it. "Is it racing for me? Or for her?" "What are you—" she started to say, but her lips pressed deep against his before he could finish. And then, cold. Not the cold of breath or lips or morning air, but deep, invasive cold. It was water. At first it was just a trickle, slipping into his mouth as her lips parted. He gagged, but she didn't seem to stop. He opened his eyes wide in panic. The stranger inside her stared back at him, into him. The water poured faster now, rushing down his throat. He bucked beneath her, trying to twist free, but her hands held firm, stronger than they should have been. His lungs screaming in pain, unable to breathe. His vision was starting to fade and blur, like a dark hallway closing in around him. The firelight flickered wildly behind her, casting long shadows across the walls, her eyes now shimmering like the surface of the well water. Just before everything went black, she leaned in harder, lips still sealed to his. And then, darkness. And then, silence. Suddenly, Nate burst back to life in a violent cough as he tried to draw in air. His first breath burned, like his lungs were scraped raw with glass. Water spilled from his mouth in gushes, soaking the front of his shirt and the wood beneath his head. Emily's voice, frantic and broken, was calling his name over and over again. "Nate! Oh my God! Nate! Breathe! Please breathe!" She was kneeling beside him, with her hands on his chest, her face soaked in tears, her lips trembling, and her red hair clinging to her cheeks. He coughed again, rolled onto his side, choking out the last bit of the water. His throat felt torn apart. What the hell? "I found you on the floor," she sobbed. "You weren't breathing, you were just soaked. I thought you were—" He flinched as she touched his shoulder. I don't remember," she whispered. "I woke up and you were there and then—" Nate sat up slowly, shivering despite the fire still crackling behind him. The world felt blurred. He wasn't sure what was real anymore. Did she actually do those things to him? Had water really poured from her mouth like that? No, that's insane, he thought. But so was all of this. He looked at her now, really looked. Her eyes were wide and terrified, but they were Emily's eyes. They were hers. Her arms were trembling. There was no strength in them now. No unnatural force left. Let's get out of here, he rasped. She nodded, yes, without saying a word. They packed their things in complete silence. The village seemed quieter than before. Neither of them had said a word as they passed the broken well or the sagging door frames. The fog had finally lifted, revealing the full remains of Chester Creek in pale morning light. All was still and silent, except for the sound of their boots on dirt and rotting leaves. By the time they reached the car, parked a few miles down a forgotten forest road, the sun was already falling behind the pines. The drive back into the city was quiet. Emily stared out the window, and Nate drove with both hands clenched too tightly on the wheel. Neither of them spoke about what happened. They didn't want to, and they didn't need to. Their loft apartment welcomed them home like an old friend. Concrete walls softened by time, overgrown houseplants leaning toward the window, and the half-finished mural on the wall behind the bed they could never agree on how to finish. It was home. They were home. They each took a long, scalding shower, separately. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was delicate, like neither of them wanted to puncture the thin layer of normalcy they'd found in each other once again. Later that night, after settling in and feeling comfortable being home, Nate opened a bottle of wine as Emily lit candles on the back patio. The hot tub steamed quietly in the spring night air, tucked into the corner of their deck, surrounded by their makeshift ivy privacy walls and the soft hum of distant traffic. Emily stepped beside the hot tub and undressed slowly, her eyes never leaving his. The tension between them wasn't gone. It was just a different type of tension now. "Come in with me," she whispered. The heat of the water wrapped around them like silk. Emily climbed onto his lap, their bodies melting together beneath the surface. Her skin was soft and slick against his, her breath warm on his neck. For the first time in days, Nate let himself really relax. And then Emily kissed him, long and deep, her hands on either side of his face, her thighs tightening around his waist, drawing him in closer. The city, the village, the nightmares, all of it faded into steam. "You're mine," she whispered. He chuckled softly. "Always." She kissed him again, longer this time, hungrier. The intensity and carnal needs rose between them, their hands exploring each other's skin everywhere they could reach. But then, something in her grip changed. Her hands slid behind his head, fingers weaving into his hair, tightening. She pressed her lips deeper, harder into his. Cold and sudden, a rush of water began surging into his mouth like just before. Nate's eyes flew open. The taste was wrong. No chlorine or wine or even her. It tasted like mud and iron and rot. He knew this. He'd experienced it once already, but convinced himself it was just a nightmare. His hand shot up to push her away, but she held fast, her body impossibly strong. He thrashed and thrashed, kicking his legs, his arms, trying to free him of her grip in any way he could, as bubbles gurgled from his nose, his lungs already full of water. Her gaze, emotionless and seemingly empty as she held him down and watched him drown beneath her. They stared into each other's eyes as his vision blurred, and the darkness, slowly and now quietly, took over. The bass thumped low and heavy, like a heartbeat buried beneath the floorboards. Blue and crimson lights washed over the pulsing crowd, catching the sweat on shoulders and collarbones and the glint of eyes meeting in the dark. Emily leaned against the bar, one elbow resting on the worn wood, her black satin dress clinging to her hips like it had been painted onto her skin. Her eyes, dark and slow-moving, scanned the dance floor without urgency until they settled on him. Andrew. Andrew was a tourist in his early 30s, tall with strong arms and a relaxed confidence that made him easy to read. He had the soft edges of someone who didn't quite know if he was in danger yet. She smiled at him, and he noticed her immediately as she walked over to him. It took her less than 10 minutes to pull him in. She's been getting better at this, quicker, honing her craft. She laughed at his jokes, touched his wrist just a little longer than necessary, and leaned in close enough for him to breathe in her perfume. She whispered into his ear, slow and sultry, "My place is just around the corner." Emily's new apartment was older than it looked from the street. Homes in Prague usually did. Vaulted ceilings, plaster walls, and dark beams that creaked faintly underfoot. The lights were warm and dim. Candles were already lit on the side table near the couch. She poured some wine while he wandered around the room, touching things gently. A book of poetry, an antique key, and a black and white photo of a ruined village. "Do you live here alone?" he asked, sipping the wine. She stepped beside him, pressing her chest against his back, her arms wrapping around his midsection. "For now," she said into his ear. He turned around, wrapped one arm around her waist to bring her body against him, while the other hand gripped her chin, pulling her face toward his, their lips meeting for the very first time. They moved together slowly, kissing as they walked. Her dress slid from her shoulders. His shirt fell to the floor, and then his pants. She turned and grabbed his hand, pulling him along. He followed her through the narrow glass door to the patio, steam curling from the edges of the waiting hot tub. "After you," she whispered. He got in the water, groaning softly as the heat swallowed him before she joined him. The hot water wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Her legs draped over either side of him as she sat on his lap, her bare skin glistening with beads of sweat and steam. With their chests pressed together and her lips finding his neck and then his jaw, and then finally his lips, the kiss deepened, soft and gentle at first, and then hungrier. She rolled her hips once, twice, slowly grinding into his lap, sighing with passion as they kissed. Andrew grinned and said, "You are really intense." "You haven't seen anything yet," she said. His hand slid up her back, fingers tangled in her hair, her body arching into his. And then she paused. Still straddling the man, she pulled back just enough to look down into his face. "I want to feel you lose all control," she whispered to him. She kissed him again, deeper, slower, holding his jaw with both hands. And then something changed. At first, Andrew thought she was just playing rougher, being a little more dominant. Her grip on him tightened, her lips pressing harder. She bore her body down on his, unrelenting. But then, water. Cold, choking water began to rush into his mouth like a waterfall, hard and fast. His lungs seized. His eyes snapped open in fear and panic as he tried pushing at her shoulders, but she didn't move. Her mouth stayed locked to his, sealing his fate. Her body didn't shift, didn't flinch, didn't move. She just pressed her body down harder onto him, slowly crushing and collapsing his chest. He tried to scream, but only bubbles fled his nostrils as he bucked and thrashed with all of his might. His hands clawed at her arms, desperate for air, desperate to breathe. His heels scraped against the bottom of the hot tub. The feeling of his ribs snapping under her chest one by one excited her desire even more, causing her to press down harder, cracking his breastbone in two. her eyes wide, staring into his, her face flushed with lust and a burning hunger that needed to be fed. He tried to fight her until the very end. With his lungs full of water and his face turning blue, his eyesight blurred until he could no longer see her staring into his soul. And as his heart was crushed from the pressure beneath Emily's chest bearing down onto him, everything turned into darkness. As soon as she noticed the light leave his eyes, Emily sat up and lifted herself off the lap of Andrew's lifeless and crushed, drowned corpse. She calmly took a towel off the rack beside the doorway and dried herself off like nothing had ever happened. She walked inside and pulled a journal out from a drawer beneath a black and white photo of Chester Creek. She opened the book and ran her finger down a numbered list of names that were all crossed out. It started with the name Nate. She made her way down to the next empty number on the list, underneath the other names. She wrote the name Andrew, and then crossed it out. And on the next line below, she added the number 24. And with that, another victim's time has run out. She may have left Chester Creek Village, but part of it never left her. Well, my friends, if you've made it this far, congratulations, you're one of us now. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, stab that like button and hit subscribe for more tales that sink beneath your skin. As always, I am your humble host, Scully. I am so glad you could join me for this tale. Now, until next time, good night, and don't drink the water.